Dr. Andrew Sentance here. He's a Senior Economic Advisor for PriceWaterhouseCoopers and served as a member of the Monetary Policy Committee from October 2006 to May 2011. He's also worked part-time as Professor for Sustainable Business at the Warwick Business School. So welcome, Andrew, and we very much look forward to hear your views as a user of business statistics. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks very much. I think it probably helps to stand on here and elevate myself so I can see you and you can see me. The first thing you'll notice is that the title that I've got on my slide here is not the same one as in the programme. This sometimes happens when you give somebody a title and you think about what you're going to say and think, well, actually, I'd like to say some slightly different things. I will get round to talking about the role of business information and providing insights into what's going on in the business world, and obviously that relates particularly to official statistics in terms of this audience. But I felt in order to do that, I really needed to sort of give a context of the changes that I thought were taking place in the business world and the challenges that business is facing, because business uses information to understand things. It's not there for its own purpose. So what is business really trying to understand in this current environment? And a major theme of what I've been talking about in PriceWaterhouseCoopers, where I'm now based as Senior Economic Advisor, is that we're in a new normal economy where the norms and the way the economy is operating is different from what we might have assumed pre-2007, before the financial crisis. And so I felt I needed to talk about this new normal economy in order to set in context what I might say about the challenges that business faces in trying to understand the current economic environment and the role of business information in that. And I did notice that the theme of this conference is the changing structure of business and how statistics and information plays into that. And so some of my thinking is very relevant to that theme as well. So, based on the principle that you've got bored of the message long before anyone's heard it, I thought I would first start off talking what is the new normal economy in my view. I've used this phrase quite a lot over the last year, but as I say, some of you may not have heard it or may have heard that I've mentioned it and thought, what the hell is Sentence talking about these days? I thought he was the guy who wanted interest rates to go up on the MPC, and now he's talking about the new normal. Then to talk about some of the challenges for business in this new normal world and how economic and business information can provide insights in terms of dealing with those challenges. So hopefully I succeed to meet my brief at the end of all that. But we've got a chance for some questions, so when I finish my presentation, if there's something I haven't covered that you think is relevant, do ask a question or raise it in that discussion. Now, one of the things that is, I think, part of the mood music of the economy at the moment is how the world economy is struggling, and the world economy is having difficulties adjusting post the financial crisis and with other big challenges. And I just put this slide up as a little bit of an antidote to that view. That's not to say that parts of the world economy are not struggling, and I think you can think of some parts of Southern Europe that are struggling an awful lot. And some parts of Northern Europe are not doing terribly well. But the general picture for the global economy is that it continues to expand, both in terms of real terms, and in this slide I've shown the world economy is measured in dollar terms. And even before the financial crisis, the world economy had expanded in dollar terms to nearly double its size in 2000 in the space of 8 years. That is a pretty strong rate of growth. I tried to persuade my colleagues on the Monetary Policy Committee in 2006-07 that the world economy was expanding quite strongly. And I think looking back with hindsight, we appreciate how strongly it was expanding. Those were two of the strongest years of world growth recorded by the IMF since 1980 at least. And we then had another of those years, very strong growth in 2010. And so looking at where we are now, I know people are pointing out that the UK economy is struggling to get back to where it was before the crisis, but in terms of the world economy in dollar terms, it's grown on average by about 4.5% between 2008 and 2012. And by the time we get to 2017, so 17 years on from 2000, the dollar size of the world economy is going to be roughly 3 times, or just under 3 times, according to the IMF, the size in 2000. Now that's a pretty dynamic world economy. But how dynamic it is depends on where you live. And the dynamic bits, unfortunately for us, are quite a way away geographically. So if you look at the bits of the world economy closest to us, the European Union, in GDP terms, that's struggling to grow at all on average. And depending on what figures you look at for the UK, we are having a similar challenge. The United States has chugged along at about 2% since the recovery started. What's interesting about that is that expectations of growth in the US have come down. Now 2% growth is seen as being, well, that's okay, as long as unemployment's coming down a bit and the labour market's not too bad. Previously, when we first came out of the financial crisis, expectations were for much higher growth, and this is part of this new normal view that I'm espousing. But the really dynamic parts of the world economy are in the Asia-Pacific region and indeed in the emerging markets more generally. And this is a very different recovery from the ones that we've had before, when the world economy's been in recession in the early 80s and the early 90s. Well, the UK economy was in recession in the early 80s, early 90s, and many other advanced economies were. Coming out of those recessions, the emerging and developing economies grew at not a particularly strong rate, probably on 3% on average. Now they're growing on average around about 6%. And so the first point I want to make is that when we're talking about the business climate that we're in, it's not just the challenges of dealing with the shock of the financial crisis and the impact that's had on the financial system. We also face in many Western economies the challenge of operating in a world economy where emerging and developing economies in the Asia-Pacific region are becoming increasingly important and are becoming effectively the motor of the world economy. So the 10 most significant economies in the Asia-Pacific region are now worth more to the world economy than the US or the European Union. And obviously that's a fairly narrow definition of the Asia-Pacific region. If you put all the economies in the Asia-Pacific region together, probably getting close to about a third of world GDP. The Asia-Pacific region, in my view, is now becoming the motor of the world economy, with China and India and other economies like Indonesia beginning to punch their weight, because these are large population economies. So even though their living standards are very still relatively low compared to the West, they're beginning to accumulate relatively large middle classes, even compared to the size of our middle class, even though it's a very relatively small minority of their population, and beginning to exert much more purchasing power on the world economy. And when this first happened, this was seen as a pretty much a beneficial development for the Western economies. New market opportunities and cheap goods coming from China and other low-cost economies. So in the 2000s and the late 90s, this was a very beneficial, seemed to be a very beneficial development for the Western economies. More recently, not just since the financial crisis, but since about the mid-2000s, we've seen the flip side, that when other parts of the world are growing very strongly, they are competing and challenging for natural resources and energy that we have customarily used, and therefore the prices of those commodities and energy sources are being driven up. And that's exerting a squeeze on Western consumer spending over and above the squeeze that we're getting from the financial crisis. And that's, to my mind, a very important feature of the new normal world we're in. It's not surprising in this environment the UK economy hasn't appeared to do particularly well. In my view, the headline figures for GDP have given a slightly overly negative picture, not because we think they're going to be revised, though they may be revised. You people in this room, or some of you people in this room, might determine that. But even if you look at some of the underlying trends, the manufacturing and services sectors, which are the two most significant sectors for employment and output in the UK, together are growing on average at about 1% per annum. The service sector is the dominant factor behind that. And construction is weighing down heavily, and some other factors like North Sea oil, which I've taken out of this slide, are weighing down heavily on growth. But if you just compare with what we think is a normal rate of GDP growth of, say, between 2 and 2.5%, this is still disappointing growth. And when I was on the MPC, the prevailing mood of economic policymakers was, well, if we get disappointing growth, we get big negative shocks, we're going to have low inflation. Well, that's not the case. And this is because the very developments that I've talked about, the growth of Asia-Pacific and emerging economies, is now exerting upward cost pressure on various commodities, energy, food, for example. The UK has been particularly exposed to that because our exchange rate took a big hit in the financial crisis. So we've had this very uncomfortable combination of relatively high inflation and disappointing growth. So that leads me to talk about this idea of a new normal. What really is it? And the basic idea is that we've been in a world for about the last 25 years which has been shaped by forces which were generally quite benign for the growth of Western economies and the UK economy. And in the period 1982 to 2007, which is a 25-year period, and I'll just flick to this slide and come back to the next one, the UK economy grew on average, even taking into account the early 90s recession, as strongly as it did in the 50s, 60s long expansion. And then after the 50s and 60s long expansion, we had this turbulent period where the sources of growth that powered the Western economies in the UK in the 50s and 60s were undermined by a combination of economic shocks, loss of confidence, other factors, high inflation. And the growth rate then, from the early 70s to the early 80s, was less than 1% in the UK economy. And we're in a similar type of period now. It's shaped by different forces, but the way I believe we should think about where we are in the economy, we've had this long expansion, which was underpinned by three main conditions. One is easy money, the financial liberalisation. Secondly, by these cheap imports from low-cost producers who are now exerting a different influence on the world economy. And thirdly, by confidence that policymakers, governments and central banks could keep our economy and other Western economies on an even keel. And all those conditions have been disrupted by things that have happened over the last 5 years, including the financial crisis. And so we're now in this new normal world of rather disappointing and uncertain growth, where those drivers of growth have gone away, but it's not clear what has replaced them. So the conditions, it's no good looking back, in my view, to the conditions which supported the period of growth from the early 80s to 2007. We're not going to recreate that go-getting financial sector. The Bank of England, the FSA, the Federal Reserve, all the authorities in the world looking at the financial sector don't want to recreate it. They are very keen for banks to behave in a very different way. We can't create that world of cheap imports because China and India and other economies have made their entry onto the world stage, and they're now beginning to compete with us for energy and commodities. And that world of confidence where central banks and governments seem to be in charge has been severely shocked by the experience of the financial crisis. And the confidence in the private sector that the authorities can steer us neatly out of this is relatively weak, if not non-existent. And in some other parts of the world, like the euro area, it's even worse than it is in the UK. So those conditions that supported this period of growth are not set to return, and there's this process of structural adjustment underway, which is affecting certain parts of the economy, and I'll talk about some of those parts of the economy at a moment. And in my view, there are significant parallels with the disappointing growth and volatility of the 1970s and early 1980s. When we were going through that period, we were conscious of, that was a period when I first started studying economics. It was a very interesting period to study economics. Many people in this room, or some people in this room, may have had the same experience. All sorts of things that were happening were things that weren't meant to happen together. Unemployment and inflation went up together. just like they have done recently. That was not meant to happen, according to something called the Phillips curve. So there was a similar degree of disappointment, confusion, and adjustment to the fact that the drivers of growth from the 50s and 60s had dissipated. Now, where my slide ends here is not the end of the story, in my view. So you'll say, I just take it up to 2016, because when you look at the Treasury's survey of independent forecasts, it's as far as they go. And I'm not saying these are my forecasts, these are independent forecasts of what we should expect for the period 2007-16, a 9-year period similar to that 73-82 period. Relatively disappointing growth, between 0.5% and 1% on average. Even more disappointing growth of consumer spending, because one thing the 50s and 60s didn't have was such strong consumer boom as we've had in the last 25 years. Consumer growth has been particularly strong in the UK and other Western economies. And if you look at the height of that bar on consumer spending, it's around about 3.5%. Now, an economy that grows on average by 2 to 2.5% and has 25 years of consumer spending growth has a bit of a problem of adjustment, and that's part of the issue that we're facing at the moment. Where did these long expansions come from? Economists have tended to emphasize technology and innovation, and that's certainly an important driver behind growth. But actually, if you think of the things that I've talked about, they've been more in these other bubbles, which reflect more economic and financial factors. So technology is, you might think, as like the sort of background driver of economic growth, but technology of itself doesn't necessarily create lots of growth. There was quite a lot of technological development in the 1930s when we had the Great Depression. Motor car industries, those of you who studied economic history will know that motor cars, electrical goods, radio, beginnings of television, all those things actually happened in the 1930s. It was only, however, in the 50s and 60s that we got a stable policy environment, we got a supportive financial regime, it was then the international Bretton Woods exchange rate system, and we got private sector expectations that had the confidence to invest and develop those technologies. So technology and innovation is important, but it doesn't of itself drive long expansions in growth. What does drive long expansion in growth is when technology and innovation comes together with a supportive and stable policy environment, a supportive and stable financial regime, and supportive private sector expectations. And those are the three bubbles that have been disrupted in the current climate. And the forces shaping where we are now are the combination of shocks that have hit the Western economies in particular. As I say, they're not uniform across the world economy, because some parts of the world economy are still doing relatively well. So the forces shaping this, what I call this phase of the new normal, is the legacy of the financial crisis. That's clearly had an impact. The pressure of rising energy and commodity prices, reflecting the continued strong growth in Asia and other emerging markets. Various forms of structural adjustments, partly an adjustment where economies had long consumer booms or construction booms, unwinding of some of those conditions, but also other microeconomic structural adjustments that are taking place and adjustments to public finances, and a breakdown of the confidence that the private sector had in, and the financial sector had in policymakers' ability to steer economies on a steady course. Now, in my view, there are two phases of this new normal, and the phase one is where we are now, and you can say, well, that's not very encouraging. I've heard a lot of economists talking recently, and they all seem to say fairly downbeat things, and that's partly a reflection of the reality that we're in. But I would highlight that if you go back to my slide here, those of you who can remember 1982, actually I was at a seminar hosted by the BBC on economic impartiality earlier this morning. Fascinating discussion with all the big heavyweights like Robert Peston and Stephanie Flanders listening to what various of us thought about the impartiality of the BBC. Yes, it was fascinating to be there. It was under Chatham House rules, so I can tell you who was there but not who said what. If you look at that 25-year expansion that took place from 1982 to 2007, Somebody mentioned the fact that 364 economists wrote to the Financial Times or the Times to say that we were all going to hell in a handcart in 1981. And lo and behold, starting in 1982, a recovery got underway that actually saw the UK economy enjoy 24 out of 25 years of calendar year growth, which I think if you predicted that in 1982, somebody would probably taken you away and sort of checked whether you're thinking straight. That wasn't the uniform prediction at that time. And I suppose my point to highlight that is that even when in the early phases of that period of growth, it wasn't clear that that could be sustained. So we may in the second half, I'm saying we may in the second half give way to a period of perhaps more sustained growth, but we probably won't recognise it very clearly at the time, certainly in the early phases. But I think in terms of thinking about the economy, it's important to recognise that those opportunities could exist, and that looking back to the pre-2007 period is not where business and investors and policymakers should be looking necessarily to the drivers of that growth. It's probably going to have a different set of growth drivers, maybe more influenced by some of the new emerging technologies like low carbon technology, maybe influenced by other developments. The sort of stability in the financial system that could underpin that growth is not going to be necessarily the go-getting sort that we saw pre-2007, but is probably likely to be a more regulated financial system. So for businesses, it's not just the challenge of weathering this rather difficult and disappointing period, which is in some respects quite unlike the period that went before, but it's also looking out for opportunities that could shape this phase 2 of what I'm calling the new normal. Now, one of the key challenges facing the UK and a number of other economies is the shift that's taking place in the consumer sector. So if you look at those bars on average for a decade of pretty strong consumer spending growth, partly reflecting the growth of money spending in consumer, in other words, nominal spending, but also reflecting the fact that inflation was pretty low, and so that translated into quite significant real increases. Money growth consumer spending actually over the recovery so far has been about 4 to 4.5% per annum. It's not been that weak, but most of that has been eaten up by inflation. So hence you've got this very erratic performance of consumer spending in particular. So one of the characteristics and one of the shifts that's taking place in the economy is this much more subdued consumer focus. So what does this mean for the implications for the business environment? What are businesses going to be thinking about in this environment? And if I had to sum up this in one sort of phrase or one message, it's a shift from looking at macro drivers to support growth and to support business development, and focusing more on microeconomic developments in markets and what's going on under the surface. So you could envisage the world that came to an end in 2007, where there was quite a strong rising tide in the UK and other Western economies, particularly in the consumer sectors. That rising tide floated quite a lot of ships, and businesses could coast up along that. Even if they weren't particularly strong businesses, they could achieve some degree of growth on that basis. The current environment is much more challenging, and companies that are going to get growth in this environment are going to have to get that on the basis not of a return of the macro tide. If companies are looking for that, they may be disappointed, but by their business fundamentals, their potential for restructuring in their industry and strong value propositions. And businesses are therefore likely to be looking to reposition themselves to find new opportunities in this low growth environment. And that to me suggests that the key drivers of growth are likely to be, first of all, a geographical repositioning, looking at the parts of the world where growth is strong, Asia, emerging markets. Not all businesses will be in a position to take advantage of that directly, and accessing some of these markets can be difficult in some industries. But if that's where the value growth is coming from, there may be also opportunities to tap into it indirectly. One form in which you can tap into it indirectly, which is benefiting the African economies and some of Latin American economies and Russia, is by producing the resources that are very much in demand in the Asia-Pacific region. But geographical repositioning towards Asia and emerging markets. Shifts driven by technology and social change. You can see this in various sectors, that even though the macro market may not be growing that strongly, certain developments associated with technology, whether it's the Apple iPhone, iPad, whether it's the growth of internet shopping, which is grown, I think, on average over the last 5 years or so by about 25% or so in value terms. Technology is still shaping the growth of markets, and companies that are well positioned to take advantage of that are going to see better growth. Changes in the policy and regulatory environment, changes in customer expectations. Consumers are being squeezed a bit more, becoming more value conscious, and that has an impact on customer expectations. And then this big challenge of managing energy and resource scarcity and cost pressures. So this is not an exhaustive list of where growth opportunities for business could come from, but it's a different type of list from the one that I described before, where it's mainly macro drivers driving growth. I just want to illustrate that by looking at the retail sector, how the difference between different trends is shaping markets. So what does this slide show? Well, it's got 5 lines on it. The second and third lines are a comparison of the growth of sales values, retail sales values, all good ONS data here for the ONS people in the audience. Growth of sales values 07 to 12 is the green line, and the previous trend for the decade 97 to 07 is the red line. And you might say, well, the retail environment on that basis does not look very different. The growth of the value of spending in retail on UK retail sales over the period since 2007 has not been that dissimilar in value terms than the previous trend. But of course we've had a very different inflation environment, so the volume trends are much more different. So you can see that we had actual retail deflation on average from 97 to 07, so the top line is the volume trend from pre-07, and the Moby blue line is the volume trend since 2007. That's quite significantly different. But then let's take out the growth of sales on the internet and look at what's going through retail stores at the moment. And there you can see that the volume of growth is my estimates of the volume of growth through retail stores, very significant than that volume pre-2007 volume trend. So looking at some of the macro drivers or the value of spending doesn't really capture what is going on in terms of the structure of some of these activities. And if you're caught on the wrong end of this, you haven't got a very well developed internet business as a retailer, that actually some of your core customers are shifting their shopping onto the retailing, onto the internet. That can be very difficult, and some of the casualties we've seen, not to mention any names, in the retail sector, that has been part of the story. So this is, I'm just illustrating how this is the microeconomic drivers becoming more important, and just illustrating that from the retail sector. Okay, so let's come back to what I said I was going to talk about, which is, what does this tell us about the insights that business is looking for from economic and business information in this current climate? And they are, I think, related to the topics that come up in my discussion of the new normal and the drivers of growth in the new normal. And I suppose the question is, these are not necessarily going to be the same things that businesses were trying to look at before the financial crisis. So this process of structural change and readjustment is shifting the focus of demands for information and insight in the business world. Now I'm giving you a very top level view, and maybe you can then use this to inform how you think individual requirements of businesses are shifting, but hopefully this is informative. So, first of all, I've talked about a world where the growth in emerging markets, the Asia-Pacific region, is that's where the dynamism is. And many businesses are responding to disappointing growth in the West by reorientating their growth strategies in that direction. And an important point to make is that those opportunities are not just for the traditional exporters in the manufacturing sector. If you look at the UK, we have actually a relatively strong services sector export performance. I think in aggregate terms we're only second among the G7 behind the United States in terms of an exporter of services. And if you then put that on a per capita basis or a percentage of GDP, though I haven't done the calculation, it looks to me like as a percentage of GDP or on a per capita basis, we are the most significant services exporter of the major economies. Now everybody says, that's the financial services, and they've gone down the tube. Well, 20% of it is the financial services, or was the financial services. So there's a lot of other things there, business services where I'm now working with PwC, education, tourism, all sorts of other creative industries and so on. So a second point is that in terms of trying to get insights from economic and business information, it's not just the traditional manufacturers who are going to be looking at these overseas markets. A third factor is how technology and other social and demographic forces are changing market structures. This is something that businesses are trying to understand much better, given that the macro drivers are less significant. They also want to understand how consumer attitudes and expectations are changing. They also want to understand how competitive advantage is shifting as economies restructure, so what's happening to relative cost levels in different geographies and different regions. And probably my final point is that when I look at a lot of official statistics, I notice that the first instinct is to translate things into a volume terms, because that's what we think is real. We need to take the inflation component out. But value growth is very important in the business world, and the sources of value growth are also important. So understanding what's happening to the value of spending and where value growth is taking place is also significant alongside volume drivers. Because if you're a business and you can get your prices rising and capture that in your margins, and those are two big ifs, that value growth can be very useful and important to you. So understanding where the source of value growth is just as important as volumes. So I hope that's informative. So I've gone on longer than I said. But I think we may still have time for questions unless lunch is totally beckoning and stomachs are grumbling.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I think we absolutely must have time for some questions. I know we're all I'm sure hungry, but we've got a little bit of flexibility this afternoon. So would anybody like to kick us off?
Martin Callingham, Birkbeck College. In the context of the current debate going on about Europe, how does that figure our position within the EU? How does that figure in your evolving new normal?
Well, I think we actually published PwC, colleagues of mine at PwC published an article about how our export market's going to shift over the next 20 years or so, looking up to 2030. And it is noticeable that because of the growth trends that I'm pointing to here, most of Europe is a relatively mature market, and those bits that we thought were a bit more dynamic, say sort of bits on the periphery of Europe and the southern periphery, haven't turned out to be as dynamic as we thought they were. So Europe is likely to be relatively slow growing compared with the emerging markets, and that, if you run through an econometric analysis of what that does, it means that the share of our trade going to the European Union, the rest of the European Union and the Euro area will continue to drop as a share. Doesn't mean that those markets aren't going to grow, but they're not going to be particularly rapidly growing. So the message, that's not surprising, that businesses are looking in the wider world for sources of growth. That doesn't mean, however, and this gets you into the sort of politics of it and the policy discussion. that somehow we need to detach ourselves from Europe. To me, that doesn't follow at all. Europe is still our closest and probably most similar market to the domestic markets we have here in the UK. So there is still sense in pursuing various forms of economic cooperation with Europe in that environment. So I would distinguish those two messages. I think that, yes, our share trade to Europe is going to go down, but it will still be substantial. So I think by our figures show that by, I think it's just slipped below 50% to the rest of Europe if you take goods and services together. And that will go down to somewhere between, probably by 2030, between 30 and 40%. But that doesn't equate that we should have somehow sort of trying to cast ourselves adrift into the North Atlantic. Geographically, we're still closely linked. And arguably, in a world where Europe as an entity is becoming a smaller share, you can make a case, I'm not saying that this is a totally proven case, but you can make a case for more economic integration to ensure that Europe punches its weight as an entity on the world stage.
Hello, it's Bob Butcher from Biz. You're talking almost to businesses there. I wonder what you would say to government. What would be if government had any influence in this? What would be the right thing to do? Would emphasising manufacturing and industrial strategy type approach be the sort of thing you say was sensible, or would you recommend other things?
I don't want to play down manufacturing, but I think overly concentrating on manufacturing may not be the right thing. I talked about the services contribution to exports, and we have a very successful manufacturing base, but it is one that has been weathered lots of storms in the past and is not, in my view, and I visited quite a lot of manufacturing companies when I was on the Monetary Policy Committee, about to spring into life and expand dramatically across a whole range of sectors. There may be some sectors that have that expansion potential, but actually one of the striking things about the performance of manufacturing in the UK since the financial crisis is, even though we've had this big depreciation in the exchange rate, hasn't really caused UK manufacturing to perform that much better than our European peers. And one of the reasons for that is, one is the sort of natural caution, which is understandable, but also genuine supply side constraints. You know, we don't have the plant or the capacity, we don't have the skills in some areas. Those would take time to build up. And I'm not convinced yet that businesses think this depreciation in the currency is going to be sustained long enough for them to have time to do that. I'm a bit sceptical about currency as a signal. So I would take a wider view and say it's not about supporting manufacturing, it's about supporting business, including services. And it's about creating the right climate for that. Now you get back then into some rather mother than apple pie things about infrastructure, skills, etc. But I would question perhaps whether well, I'm not sure it helps to call it an industrial strategy. I would probably call it a business strategy or competitiveness strategy. I'm not sure we've still got the right suite of policies which are being pursued quickly enough. I mean, if you take infrastructure as an example, we all know we're in a big political debate about where to build another airport. It's not a very good signal to the private sector about the UK's international focus. The fact that actually the decision even where to build any extra airport capacity is kicked off into the long grass. I think skills and education, I would argue that our current suite of labour market policies is targeted much more towards the problems of unemployment we had in the 80s and the 90s, which were more around older groups who have been displaced from manufacturing in the traditional industrial regions. We need a much better developed suite of policies targeted towards the younger generation to make sure that everybody under 21 is either in training or education or in a job. I'm not quite sure I believe that they should be unemployed, but you know, gets into sensitive political territory. I think you know the message is in these traditional areas like skills, the business climate, tax reform, infrastructure. We need a bolder approach. It sounds a bit like Heseltine in some ways, but that's not quite as interventionist.
Well, we've got time for one more question.
Oh.
Possibly two. We've got three.
Oh, no, no.
Yeah, Sanjeev, and then one down the back there.
Thank you very much. I'm Sanjeev Mahajan from the ONS. Your last 30 seconds or a minute, I think, is the thing that's caught me for this morning. And that is, you used the word quickly, and it is quickly. And I think what's happened is you've got the US and you've got the UK and the Western developed economies. They went through an industrial revolution, and that industrial revolution took place over the best part of 100 years. And as technology was changing, and the rate at which technology was changing was increasing. What's happening now is many of those developed economies have developed and matured, and they've gone through particular recessions. And if you take 79, you take 89, the outcomes and the recovery structure was very different. China, India, the Asian economies, Brazil, etc., are now going to an industrial revolution that's not going to take 100 years. It's going to be substantially quicker, and the rate of growth and the rate of change of technology today compared to 100 and 200 years ago is also rapidly growing. So the idea of iPods and phones and mobiles, etc., even a decade ago, some of these weren't even a thought. Okay, so the thing, or the challenge, as I would put it, for government and policymakers in the EU and the US is to become more visionary. How are they going to embrace this change that's inevitably going to take place? And looking at the past is not going to help. The policies are going to be very much future-driven. So, for example, there are companies, and I think in some of the earlier presentations, there's a lot of growth of new companies. But the structure of the companies will be very different. They may have the ideas, they may have the head office, they may have the invoicing in the UK, but the production is going to take place somewhere completely different. And with those low cost base, they can generate margins, they can still cover transportation distribution costs, and actually be sustainable over the long term. So the phrase globalization is actually very, very, very important. And actually, so one of the biggest challenges the statistical offices have in measuring what GDP is. And my personal view, if we're not already there, in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, the concept of a national GDP will not exist, because it will be so difficult to measure. It will conceptually be meaningless. The idea is in one country, the production is in another country, and the sales are everywhere in the world.
Well, I'd agree with a lot of that. I think that one of the big challenges, and I think it's flagged up in my presentation, is in this very rapidly integrating global economy, how do we track national aggregates? How do you do anything nationally when things are highly interdependent? It's very striking when I was on the Monetary Policy Committee how all the big shocks that hit the monetary policy, the UK economy, and drove the decisions of the MPC, even before I arrived, they were all driven by the global economy predominantly. So you're right to flag up that measurement challenge. And also I would say keeping pace. I think my challenge back when people say that GDP is, appears unduly weak and maybe mismeasured is there may be more new business activity than perhaps we're keeping collected in the GDP figures, which may be showing up on the employment side of the equation, but is not yet properly digested in GDP. And when we get sort of 3 or 4 years' time, we've worked out where it all is and what it's doing, that might change the picture. I do think there's a challenge to policymakers, but I don't think it's just about vision. Yes, we need better leadership and vision, but my final point would be what we have discovered when economies go through this process of change is that it's not governments that drive the change, it's by and large the market and probably the private sector companies that get on successfully on the bandwagon or develop the new ideas and run with them. And we do have to, I think, perhaps reawaken the idea that the market needs to be allowed to develop and tell us where the new growth opportunities are. I see a little bit too much in the growth debate, even perhaps in the Heseltine report and the activities of BIS, of trying to second guess that. And I think we went through a period in the 70s when that didn't work. And I'm not convinced that policymakers have got a better sort of finger on the pulse now. What they can do is show that they're aware of the direction in which our economy needs to move, the structural changes that need to take place, and offer as much sort of underlying help to the private sector to make the adjustments. That would be my approach.
Let's take the one final question.
This is a very heavily policy-influenced discussion for a business statistics conference. Obviously,
Hi, so Alex here at Sainsbury's. It's just really a concern about reaching this sort of more benign phase 2 of the new normal, which is that all of these factors really require private sector investment. So investing in sort of technology, emerging markets, and sort of driving value growth. And if you look at coming from the private sector, there seems to be a real, and there has been for a long time, a nervousness around investing and a mindset that if you can't put it off, just put it off because of the continuing uncertainty. And you can see this in things like the Purchasing Managers Index, which has been consistently below 50, and to me seems a very clean measure of sort of business confidence. How severe do you think this, how severe a shock do you think we've got in store as the repercussions of this period of sustained underinvestment start to become apparent? And how much do you think it's a challenge for us reaching this second phase of new normal?
yeah, I was quite careful. I was sort of talked about may, could. You know, this was using a historical parallel, and clearly there are other scenarios out there where confidence doesn't return. We get further big shocks, and the whole process is more prolonged. I suppose my underlying principle is that the capitalist system, market system, if it's given the chance, does reinvent itself and does seek out growth opportunities. If you have faith in that, something more sustained may emerge. But even when it emerges, I made the point, it may not be very apparent at the time. And the sources of growth may be different. So in sectors of the economy which benefited from the previous wave of growth, there may still be the perception that things are disappointing and things are not recovering. So I'm very aware of that, and I don't. If I use the word benign, perhaps I shouldn't. It may not feel benign, but I suppose what I'm trying to highlight there is it's not just for business a matter of hunkering down, because yes, the caution that you've talked about is there at the moment, but businesses generally succeed by identifying opportunities and trying to maximise their potential. And if business continues to hunker down sort of indefinitely, I think that says something rather negative about the dynamism and the innovative capacity of British business or Western businesses generally. And as an innate optimist, I feel that's too pessimistic a conclusion. But I'm really saying that there's quite possibly something out there. You should be looking for it in your markets, because you don't want to be in a position, say 5 years hence, when suddenly new trends are emerging. You think, well, I wish I'd taken advantage of that 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm trying to give a classic economist on the one hand, on the other hand message. Yes, things are difficult, slow growth, volatility for the time being. But you can see in areas, I mentioned low carbon technology, other forms of technology, there are areas of growth emerging. And if a business is just purely in a negative mindset, I think it may well get caught out.